The night in the small town of Havenville began quietly as always. The light from the few lanterns scattered along the deserted streets barely made it through the thick fog. Everyone was known here, and strangers were spotted at once. The town lived according to its own laws, measured, careful, as if afraid to awaken something dark underneath the idyll. The Banks family home stood on the outskirts of the neighborhood. It was a small, cozy building with a shabby porch and a carefully tended garden. Here lived little Ellie, a 9-year-old girl who had spent most of her life in a wheelchair. Ellie suffered from a rare lung disease and could not breathe without an oxygen machine. This machine stood next to her bed, puffing quietly like a faithful friend, keeping her fragile life going. Her parents, Michael and Sarah Banks, were known to everyone in town. Michael, the mayor of Havenville, earned respect for his efforts to make life better for residents. Sarah, a school teacher, kind and patient, adored her family and devoted all of her free time to Ellie. Their love for their daughter was boundless, and the fight for her life was relentless. But on this night, it all went wrong. Ellie sat in her wheelchair by the window, looking out at the dark sky. Her oxygen machine was working properly, making the measured sounds she had long accepted as part of her life. Sarah was cooking dinner in the kitchen, and Michael was in another meeting at City Hall. The house seemed peaceful, but trouble was already looming over the city. A sharp knock on the door brought Sarah out of her thoughts. A uniformed policeman stood on the doorstep. Tall, stout, with a cold stare. It was Officer Harrington. Everyone knew he had a tough temper, but no one would have thought that behind that exterior lay something much worse. "We have a complaint, ma'am." His voice sounded like an icy wind. He didn't give Sarah time to ask questions, just pushed her aside and stepped inside. Ellie, hearing the noise, looked anxiously toward the door. The policeman stepped closer, his face reflecting contempt. "That machine's too loud," he said, as if it were an insignificant matter. Sarah rushed to her daughter, covering her with her chest. "Please, come out. You have no right." Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. Harrington hummed as if enjoying her fear. "I'm here to clean up the mess." His hand reached for the hose connecting the machine to Ellie's mask. Sarah screamed, trying to stop him, but Harrington was stronger. In one sharp motion, he cut the oxygen hose. The machine made one last sound and went silent. Ellie began to gasp. Her eyes went wide with horror. Sarah tried desperately to connect the spare hose, but her hands were shaking, tears streaming down her face. Harrington just stood and watched, as if he enjoyed the sight. Neighbors, hearing the screams, ran outside. They saw Sarah leaping out of the house, holding Ellie in her wheelchair and screaming for help. Harrington calmly followed, adjusting his uniform. "It's just a complaint," he said to those who had begun to gather around him. But his indifferent gaze and heavy stride gave him away something frightening. Sarah looked up at the gathered crowd. "He wanted to kill her," she shouted, pointing at Harrington. The moment she said those words, the city realized for the first time in years that behind the cloak of tranquility lurked real evil. The next morning, the town woke up very different. The streets of Havenville, usually alive with the whispering of neighbors and the clacking of heels on the sidewalks, were suddenly silent. All people could talk about was the accident at the Banks house. The first wave of rumors spread during the night. Neighbors who witnessed Officer Harrington's madness could not keep quiet. "He cut the oxygen hose of a girl in a wheelchair." They repeated to each other like an incantation. Many didn't even want to believe it. How could a man who wore a uniform and swore to uphold the law do such a thing? But the more details became known, the clearer it became to everyone. It was true. By morning, the town was divided. Some condemned Harrington, openly calling him a racist and a monster. He did it because she's black, an elderly Mrs. Wilson said quietly but confidently outside a local store. Others tried to justify his act, adding fuel to the fire of racism that lurked in the hearts of many residents. Maybe he was just defending order? Maybe these Bankses are letting themselves get too much? Someone in the crowd would throw out, but avert their eyes if they heard an angry, "Sarah Banks is a holy woman," from outraged neighbors. Sarah and Michael spent the entire night at the hospital. Ellie was stabilized, but her fragile body had been through too much. She sat in her wheelchair, pale, with the oxygen mask that now seemed to be her only salvation. Sarah never took a step away from her, her eyes burning with despair and anger. Michael tried to keep a cool head, but inside he was seething. He, the mayor, had to explain how this could happen in his town. As the family struggled with shock and pain, social media went into an uproar. Local teens who recorded video of the scene posted it online. Harrington walking out of the Banks' home with a scowl and a look of contentment. Sarah screaming for help. Neighbors standing on their doorsteps in horror. The video went viral in a matter of hours. Comments poured in. "This is impossible. How can this happen in the 21st century? Black kids have no place here. That's the truth of life," wrote someone whose avatar was adorned with a Confederate flag. "Justice for Ellie." Voices of support were beginning to gather. The news reached the local media. By evening, correspondents from the major channels were already traveling around the city, interviewing residents. They found those who did not hide their rage, but also those who tried to justify Harrington's actions. On one of the live shows, Sarah stepped in front of the camera, holding on to Michael, her voice shaky but firm. "My daughter almost died because someone decided her life was less valuable." Harrington committed this with the certainty that he could get away with it. But I'm not going to let that happen. No one has the right to cut the oxygen hose of a little girl, no matter what color she is. Sarah's words blew up the internet, but with them came threats. Maybe this family should get out of town, began whispering on the outskirts. On one of the fences near their home, a sign appeared in paint. "Get out." Neighbors who used to smile when they met were now crossing to the other side of the street. At the same time, support was beginning to grow. Several activists from a neighboring town came to Havenville to organize a march in defense of Ellie and her family. "Ellie's life is important," they chanted as they marched through the streets. But it wasn't just sympathizers who greeted them. Some residents stood on their porches with cold contempt and crosses in their hands, as if they wanted to show who owned their town. By evening, Sarah and Michael learned that Harrington had been suspended, but it was too little too late. Sarah knew one dismissal wasn't enough. She looked at Ellie in her wheelchair, breathing quietly through her mask, and vowed that she would get justice, no matter what the cost. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Has something similar happened in your life? Perhaps you've faced injustice or seen someone fight for the truth in an environment where everyone is against it. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. We continue. Officer Harrington was never a hero to the citizens of Havenville. In the years when he first started in the service, he was considered promising. Stern, determined, always with impeccable uniform. But soon his view of order and order itself began to diverge from conventional norms. Rumors about his rigid methods began to appear almost immediately, but none of his superiors paid any attention to it. "He's just doing his job," they said. Now that Harrington's name resounded in every corner of the city, his past began to surface like dirt that had long been hidden under water. Harrington came from a family where reverence for the old ways and hatred of change were inherited. His father was an ardent supporter of the purity of the nation, and, as the owner of a small shop, refused to serve customers with a different racial background. Harrington from childhood absorbed these views, which over the years turned into a rigid intransigence. Even at school, he was known for bullying black classmates, but teachers turned a blind eye. When Harrington joined the police force, he gained power, the power he had dreamed of all his life. Now he could openly display his superiority behind his badge. To him, every black resident of Havenville was a threat or potential intruder. His hatred was especially manifested toward those who he felt deserved nothing, as he often said. People remembered how he stopped a black teenager riding a bicycle a few years ago and made him kneel on the side of the road, allegedly for suspicious behavior. Harrington was always looking for a way to exert his power. The Bankses were like a thorn in his side. The African-American family that lived in a nice house was respected by everyone, and Michael Banks was the mayor. Harrington didn't like the fact that people he considered beneath him could be successful and command respect. The incident with Ellie was the moment he decided to demonstrate that no one was above him, not even the girl in the wheelchair, whose life depended on a thin oxygen hose. Other incidents came up as well. A couple of residents recalled how Harrington rudely insulted a woman by refusing to help her just because she was African American. "There are too many people like you here," he threw at her at the time. Another story discussed around town involved an elderly man who Harrington had illegally arrested for crossing the road too slowly. No one knew why these cases had been hushed up before, but now they were becoming the basis for anger. "He has always hated us," said one resident when interviewed by journalists. "He thinks this town belongs only to him and people like him, and now he has decided that he can take children's lives." There were those who defended him. Maybe he just made a mistake? Maybe he was provoked, some residents said, but even they knew that such excuses sounded weaker and weaker with each new fact about Harrington. Soon, his old posts started appearing on social media. There were pictures of him with guns with the comment, "The law starts with a bullet," or his declarations that this world needs cleaning up. The town knew. Harrington had always been like this. People were just afraid to speak up. Until today. Harrington was called in for questioning. His superiors were forced to act under public pressure, but he answered questions with restraint, almost indifference, avoiding direct accusations. "I was doing my job," he once said, without hiding his contempt. His face remained stony, but his eyes revealed his true nature. He was a man to whom other people's pain meant nothing. Revealing all the dark pages of Harrington's life only fueled anger. People began to demand not only his dismissal, but also his arrest. Protesters surrounded Harrington's house, shouting accusations and words of support for Ellie. But even at this point, he wasn't hiding. He stood at the window of his house, looking at them with an expression as if all this was just proving him right. That night was the beginning of what would tear the city in two. Michael Banks stood at the hospital window, looking up at the darkening sky as if trying to find answers. In the room behind him, Ellie sat in her wheelchair. The oxygen mask fit tightly around her face, and the machine buzzed quietly, keeping her breathing again. Sarah, exhausted and pale, wouldn't let go of her daughter's hand. This was their new reality, fear for every minute of her life and an anger that swelled ever stronger. Michael wasn't just a father. He was a mayor, a man to whom the residents had entrusted their fates by voting him into office. But how could he stand before them now, knowing that his own daughter had nearly died at the hands of a police officer serving his city? Michael felt torn between his personal pain and his responsibility to be a strong leader. The next morning, Michael decided he couldn't keep quiet. His secretary had already hinted several times that it would be better not to add fuel to the fire, but Michael ignored the advice. The city was on the verge of exploding, and he, as mayor, had to intervene. That day, a crowd gathered in the town's main square. People, despite their fear, came out to hear what Michael Banks had to say. Among them were those who supported him and those who had been waiting for his fall for a long time. Standing in front of the crowd was Ellie in her wheelchair. Sarah was beside her, hugging her daughter as always, as if protecting her from an invisible enemy. Michael stepped to the podium. His face was stern, but there was a pain in his eyes that instantly silenced the crowd. He glanced around at the faces of the people, whose expressions ranged from support to dislike. "I stand before you not only as mayor, but also as a father," he began. His voice shook, but he quickly pulled himself together. "This week, my family has been through something no family should have to go through. My daughter, a girl in a wheelchair who has been fighting her whole life for the right to breathe, nearly lost that opportunity, all because of the actions of a man who was supposed to be protecting our city." The crowd whispered. Michael raised his hand, demanding silence. Harrington committed a crime. His act was cruel, senseless, and, let's be honest, hate-filled. I know many of you feel the same way I do: anger, shock, disbelief. But there are those who are trying to justify his actions, who say that what I'm saying is an attempt to stir up conflict. It's not. He paused, trying to find the words. The crowd listened in complete silence. Harrington didn't just break the law, he was racist. This is not the first time this has happened. This is the same poison that is slowly killing our city. And we have to be honest. If we don't fight it, this poison will destroy us all. His words caused a storm of emotions. People started shouting different slogans. Justice for Ellie. Racism is not our tradition. Logically, but at the same time, someone shouted, "You're just protecting your own." Michael didn't back down. He looked at the crowd, his voice louder. "I make a promise to you, to the people of Havenville, and to my family. I will do whatever it takes to bring Harrington to justice. I will make sure this never happens again. But I'm asking you, don't let this tear us apart. We have to be stronger." The crowd was still buzzing, but now there was a look of respect on many people's faces. Michael knew that his words would be received differently. Some would see them as strength, others as weakness. But he could no longer remain silent. After the performance, Michael returned home. Sarah met him with a look of contradiction. "Do you think they'll listen to you?" she asked quietly. "Do you think this city full of hate will change because of your words?" "I don't know, Sarah," Michael answered, sitting down next to Ellie. He took her small hand gently, feeling the warmth of her fingers. "But I have to try. For her." In the evening, a new wave of discussions began on social networks. The video of Michael's speech gained thousands of views. People shared their thoughts. Some supported him. Some accused him of using his daughter. And in the shadows, beyond the borders of the internet, somewhere in the dark corners of the city, whispers were already beginning to circulate. This mayor is going too far. The town of Havenville lived in suspense. Every morning began with new headlines in the newspapers and heated discussions on the street. The investigation into the Banks House incident continues, reporters wrote, but residents no longer believed in objectivity. Everyone knew. This case wasn't just about Officer Harrington. It was about the racism that permeated every pore of this city. The investigation began with promises. The chief of police, Captain Lawrence, made a statement to the city administration. His words sounded confident. "We will be impartial and professional. The law is the same for everyone, regardless of position." But those who knew Lawrence intimately understood. His job was to protect the system. Harrington was part of it. Already, in the first few days, it was clear that something was going wrong. The internal affairs officers who were supposed to question Harrington suddenly disappeared from public view. Documents corroborating complaints against the officer in recent years were unavailable. One resident who had previously filed a complaint against Harrington for rough treatment told reporters that her application was lost. The Banks family found themselves in the spotlight, but not in the center of support. Michael, as mayor, tried to get justice, but he had to face rejection at every turn. Sarah, already tired of endless humiliation, felt like a stranger in her own town for the first time in her life. When Sarah went to the police station to inquire about the progress of the investigation, she was met with a cold welcome. The officer on duty did not even bother to stand up when he saw her. "What can I do for you?" His tone was soaked with contempt. "I want to know what's up with the Harrington case," Sarah replied firmly, trying not to show her anger. The officer grinned. "It's business as usual, Mrs. Banks. It's all legal." "Under what law?" "Your law?" Her voice shook with rage. "This man almost killed my daughter in a wheelchair. Are you going to defend him?" The officer rose slowly, his gaze turning cold. "Perhaps you should consider that your daughter is too fragile for these conditions," he said with feigned sympathy. "Maybe it's not just Harrington's fault, but your own." Sarah felt her heart beat faster. This wasn't just humiliation. It was a blow aimed at the heart of her pain. That same day, Michael demanded a meeting with Captain Lawrence. Their conversation was brief but tense. "You must understand, Captain," Michael began, trying to remain calm. "This is not just an incident. This is a crime. And if you try to keep it quiet, the consequences will be disastrous." Lawrence replied with a thin smile. "Minus Mr. Mayor." His voice sounded restrained but cold. "I advise you to be careful. Your actions could be seen as pressure on law enforcement. That would not be good for your reputation." Michael stood up, feeling his patience at an end. "Reputation? You're telling me about reputation when my daughter almost died in her wheelchair because of one of your men? Reputation?" Lawrence didn't answer, only silently watching as Michael walked out of the office. Meanwhile, a wave of protest was rising in the city. People demanded justice, but there were also those who defended Harrington. A banner appeared on one of the streets. "Let's support our officers," and next to it, graffiti reading, "We don't need strangers." Rumors began spreading on the internet that the Banks family was using their daughter for PR. Fake posts with Michael's alleged statements about their special rights took over social media. This was the beginning of a campaign to discredit them. Sarah cried into the night, sitting next to Ellie, who smiled at her despite everything. "Mom," the girl whispered through the mask, her voice weak but confident, "you mustn't give up." These words were a reminder to Sarah that her fight is not only for justice, but also for Ellie's future. In the meantime, however, a game had begun behind the closed doors of the administration, with powerful figures discussing how to save face for the city. Suggestions ranged from firing Harrington without a trial to closing the case altogether. Michael felt he was alone in this struggle. Chaos was growing. Each day brought new challenges, but Michael and Sarah weren't going to stop. They had a purpose in their eyes, not only to punish Harrington, but to change the very system that had allowed him to be what he had become. The morning in Havenville began with the resounding echo of footsteps on the sidewalk. Crowds of protesters filled the town's main street, holding placards that read, "Justice for Ally," "Black Lives Matter," "Stop Being Silent." Shouts echoed above the crowd, growing louder with each step. "We will not leave until the truth is out." People who had been bound by years of fear and humiliation finally found the courage to say loudly what they had always whispered behind closed doors. The Banks family was at the center of this struggle. Sarah, holding Ellie's hand, walked ahead of the march, her eyes full of tears but her voice firm. Ellie sat in her wheelchair, her face pale and an oxygen mask jiggling on her nose. Despite her condition, she looked out at the crowd, as if drawing strength from their support. "This little girl is a symbol of our struggle," Sarah said to the crowd as she stopped outside City Hall. "She is a child who just wants to live, and she has been the target of hate. We will not let this happen again. We demand justice." Sarah's words caused a wave of applause and shouts. People chanted her name, but not everyone was on their side. On the outskirts of the crowd were groups of people who had come to observe rather than support. They carried placards with inscriptions like "Support our officers" and "Stop using race as a weapon." Among them, Harrington had many secret supporters. These men whispered among themselves, casting angry glances at the protesters. "They're ruining our city," one of them said. "They always have something to complain about." The words spread like poison throughout the city. Racial tensions that had been hidden for years under the cloak of polite society now erupted with renewed vigor. Countless comments on social media were accompanied by hatred. Some supporting Ellie and her family, others defending Harrington, insisting he was just doing his job. The protests were not limited to words. On the third day of the demonstration, clashes broke out. A group of protesters surrounding the police station clashed with officers who tried to disperse the crowd. People shouted accusations and waved placards, and officers responded with orders to disperse. Soon, smoke grenades were thrown. "They're suppressing us," shouted in the crowd, "because we are black." These words were like a spark that ignited an already burning fire. A riot broke out. Young people, broken by injustice and anger, began setting trash cans on fire and smashing storefronts. The police used force, and more officers, equipped as if for war, appeared on the streets. Sarah saw it from her kitchen window. She cried as she watched the city she loved so much turn into a battlefield. Michael sat at the table, his face grim. "I tried to stop it," he said quietly, "but they don't listen. They see us as enemies, even if we want justice." "You have to talk, Michael," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "If you don't speak, it'll be the end for Ellie, for all of us." Meanwhile, words that people had previously been afraid to say out loud began to resound in the city. Old grudges, racist slogans, and mutual hatred surfaced. People blamed each other for the destruction of the town, but no one wanted to face the truth. Havenville had long been divided. It was just Harrington cutting the oxygen hose of a girl in a wheelchair that was the catalyst that exposed everything. The next day, Michael addressed the residents again, now via television and the internet. His face was tense, his voice firm. I'm reaching out to all the people of Havenville. This town has always prided itself on its togetherness, but now we see hatred tearing us apart. I do not apologize for fighting for justice for my daughter. I am fighting for justice for all of us. But destruction and hatred will not help us. We need to unite and fight against what has created this chaos, the injustice that has been hiding behind the mask of law for years. These words resonated with many, but not all. The town began to divide. Those who supported the bank's family demanded justice louder than ever. But those who sided with Harrington became even more aggressive, certain that their world was crumbling. The night ended with the sound of sirens. A fire blazed in the distance, a sign that peace in Havenville remained an unattainable dream. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our story from. Have there been similar instances in your life where injustice has touched you or your loved ones personally? Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation and share your opinion. It's important. We continue. Ellie sat in her wheelchair in the middle of the living room, surrounded by a silence that seemed deafening. Her oxygen machine hummed softly, but even that sound couldn't mask the tension in the house. Sarah sat beside her, clutching her hands that shook with impotent rage. She looked at her daughter, her pale face, her frightened eyes behind the mask, and tears flowed silently down her cheeks. The girl had gasped again in the night, and they had barely had time to hook up the backup hose. Everything reminded of that horrible day when the oxygen hose had been cut before their eyes. Since then, her condition had only gotten worse. Sarah spent a sleepless night at Ellie's bedside, whispering prayers. Her voice shook and the words came out broken, but she continued, "Lord, please don't take her away from us. Please give her the strength to breathe. Give her life." She squeezed her daughter's hands, feeling their coldness, and wondered how long Ellie could hold on. Michael was hardly ever home. He was at City Hall, trying to deal with the chaos that had taken over the city. Sarah knew he was trying. He promised justice, promised to change the system, but all that meant he was rarely there when they needed him most. She loved him, but right now her heart was full of anger. Every time he came home, tired and broken, she saw him not as a mayor, but as a man who had failed to protect their daughter. "She was choking again, Michael," Sarah whispered as he entered the house. His face was gray with fatigue and he struggled to look her in the eye. "I know, Sarah. Yeah, I'm trying." His voice was quiet, like a man who no longer believed in his own strength. "Are you trying? And she's dying. Every night I think she might not wake up." Sarah stood up and turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. "And you're out there somewhere with these people who hate us, who say it's our fault. Did you hear what someone wrote on the fence? Banks, go away. How can you fight for them when they want to destroy us?" Michael approached her, but Sarah pulled away. She couldn't forgive him for feeling abandoned. Michael lowered his head, but then said, "If I stop, Sarah, if I quit, then who's going to fight? Harrington will win. They'll all win. I can't let that happen." Sarah turned around sharply. "What about fighting for your family? For her?" She pointed to Ellie, who sat quietly in her wheelchair, listening to their conversation. Her eyes were full of tears, but she couldn't speak because of the mask. Michael walked over to his daughter, knelt down in front of her, and took her small hand. "Ellie, I promise I'll make sure this never happens again. I promise." But the girl just looked at him and shook her head. Even she, at 9 years old, knew that his promises meant nothing as long as there were people in this town who hated her for the color of her skin, who considered her life less important. Meanwhile, in the city, the situation was getting worse. A crowd of Harrington supporters began to gather in front of the police building, shouting slogans that the officer was only doing his duty. They brought with them placards depicting the American flag and slogans like, "Protect our heroes." Michael knew that these people were not just defending Harrington, they were defending the hatred that was directed at his family. But the worst part was that among these people were his former supporters. People who had once voted for him were now openly accusing him of betrayal. Michael could hear the whispers, "He sold out. He chose them over us." This hatred was tearing him apart, but he couldn't afford to break down. That night, Sarah sat next to Ellie again. The girl was panting, her breathing intermittent, and Sarah began to pray again. Michael entered the room, his face grim. "I'm calling the doctor," he said. "You already did," Sarah replied, her voice full of bitterness. "They said they couldn't help, that it was stress. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see her dying, Michael?" Michael sat down next to her, taking her hand, but Sarah pulled it away. "Just save her, Michael. If you want to fight, start with her." That night was the longest of their lives. Ellie was struggling to breathe, and her parents sat beside her, each of them feeling the weight of their mistakes and their inability to cope with a world that seemed set against them. Outside the window, shouting could be heard. The crowd had gathered outside again, some shouting slogans, some shouting curses at the Banks family. But inside the house, there was only silence and fear that clenched hearts. There was always something hidden in the small town of Havenville, something no one wanted to talk about out loud. Years of peace, deceptive quiet, and friendly smiles on the streets hid underneath dark stories that only the victims and their abusers knew about. After the incident with Ellie, those secrets began to creep out, like rusty gears that could no longer be hidden behind a pretty facade. Local journalist Martha Raines, who has long studied the hidden problems of the town, began her own investigation. She knew that Ellie's case was not just an isolated incident, but the tip of an iceberg. As she began digging into Officer Harrington's past, she uncovered reports no one had ever seen. Complaints from residents, closed cases, insults, and threats that went unpunished. Harrington had always been violent, but as it turns out, he wasn't the only one. In the archives, Martha found an old report about a man named Walter Jenkins. In 1995, he was arrested for drunken behavior, even though he was sober and just waiting for his wife outside the store. Walter died in his cell 2 hours after being arrested. The report listed the cause of death as heart failure, but Jenkins' widow told a different story. She claimed that the officers beat him to death, but no one wanted to listen to her at the time. These names started popping up everywhere. People recounted how Havenville police officers terrorized African American families for years, especially those who tried to fight for their rights. One man recalled how his brother was accused of a theft he did not commit and how he disappeared for days before being found beaten in the woods outside of town. He survived, but was left crippled, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Martha met these people by writing down their stories. She published them one by one in the local newspaper, and each one went viral on the internet. People from all over the city began sharing their stories. Former police officers who had left the force to keep their conscience began to speak out. They said that officers like Harrington made up the core of the system, a closed group where racism was the unspoken norm. They called themselves gatekeepers and believed they were protecting the city from those they deemed undesirable. These guards were humiliated, arrested without cause, and even abused for years, but all their cases were covered up. Another shocking detail surfaced. One witness said that several years ago, Harrington was seen at a private party attended only by white officers and influential city residents. There, they discussed the problem of the growing number of African Americans in Havenville and talked about how to bring order back. Harrington was one of the most active participants. None of those present testified officially, but rumors spread quickly. Sarah Banks, sitting next to Ellie in her wheelchair, read these articles and couldn't believe her eyes. She had always known there was racism in the city, but she had no idea how deeply rooted it was. Each new account, each story of pain and humiliation only made her angrier. She couldn't forgive herself for trusting this town. Michael, who was in the mayor's office at the time, faced a new problem. He began to come under pressure. Some of his colleagues in the administration demanded that he put an end to these rumors. They insisted that Martha Raines was inciting hatred, that her articles were undermining the credibility of the police. Michael knew this wasn't true, but he felt he was being pushed back. "If you continue to support this campaign," one of the deputies told him, "it will destroy the whole city. You'll be charged with sedition. You'll lose everything." Michael flared up. "The city has already been destroyed," he shouted. "You just don't want to face the truth. People have suffered for years, and you've turned a blind eye. And now that the truth is coming out, you want to silence me?" The deputy only shrugged his shoulders. "You're making a choice, Michael. Those choices come at a price." Meanwhile, a new tragedy has erupted in the city. A young boy, a 17-year-old African American named Jaden Carter, was found beaten outside the police station. He miraculously managed to survive, but he was in critical condition. His mother, sobbing in front of reporters, said that Jaden was just walking home after work when he was stopped by two officers. She claimed they beat him up because he refused to show them his bag. This incident was the last straw. The crowd gathered again in front of the police building. People shouted, "How many more victims must there be? Who will be next?" Sarah had brought Ellie in her wheelchair to this rally, and when people saw the girl sitting there with an oxygen mask, their anger turned into a powerful wave. But as the protests grew, so did the resistance. Graffiti threatening the Banks family appeared on the walls. On several occasions, stones were fired at their house. The fear Sarah and Michael felt for Ellie became almost unbearable. But they knew they couldn't give up. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it was. The evening in Havenville began with a dark sense of foreboding. The streets were no longer as quiet as usual, with protesters shouting and waving placards demanding justice. The dark windows of the police station loomed above them, behind which the shadows of officers could be seen. There was a smell of smoke in the air as people began burning trash cans, creating fire barricades. The Banks family was at the center of the action. Sarah held Ellie's hand as she sat in her wheelchair, her oxygen machine working properly, but the girl's face was tense. Michael stood nearby, silently watching the crowd. He knew this was the moment when things could get out of control. "We've been silent for too long," came a voice over the loudspeaker. "We demand justice. We will not leave until Harrington and others like him are held accountable for their crimes." The crowd shouted back as if in a unified rush. There was a mixture of anger and despair in its ranks. Many had come with good intentions, but among the protesters were those who craved chaos. They jostled each other, whispering, passing bricks and Molotov cocktails from hand to hand. Sarah felt her heart clench with fear. She turned to Michael. "This is getting dangerous, Michael. We have to get Ellie home. This place is not for her." Michael, however, stared ahead, his face grim. He knew that walking away now would be seen as weakness. But Ellie... He looked at his daughter, her frail figure in the wheelchair, and realized the risk was too great. "Take her home, Sarah. I'll stay," he said, but his voice was full of anxiety. Sarah nodded. She turned Ellie's wheelchair around and started making her way through the crowd, trying to avoid the aggressive demonstrators. But the screams were getting louder and louder, and she knew this was just the beginning. Suddenly, there was a rumble. One of the protesters threw a brick through the window of the police station. Shards of glass fell to the pavement like freezing rain. This was the signal for the others. Dozens of people began storming the building, shouting slogans and threatening the officers inside. Streams of water began pouring from the roof of the station as police tried to disperse the crowd. But instead of calming the protesters, it only increased their rage. Someone set fire to a police car parked at the entrance. The flames spread quickly, lighting up the night sky. The police responded violently. Dozens of officers in helmets and body armor, armed with batons and tear gas, ran out of the building. They began to close in on the crowd, beating those who could not escape. The protesters shouted, defended themselves, and threw stones, but their ranks began to thin. Michael, being at the epicenter, tried to stop the violence. He shouted and waved his arms, but no one listened. His voice was lost in the noise of the sirens, screams, and crashing. "Stop it!" he shouted, addressing the officers. "You are inciting conflict. Stop it!" But instead of listening to him, one of the officers pushed him aside, throwing him roughly. "You're not my boss today, Mr. Mayor." Those words hit Michael harder than a fist. He realized that even his own team was not going to obey. He tried to maintain control, but the city was already burning, both literally and figuratively. Meanwhile, Sarah and Ellie, who had managed to move away from the square, were stopped by a small group of people. Their faces were hidden under hoods, but it was clear from their aggressive posture that they had not come to support them. "Do you think your family is special?" one of them said, looking at Sarah. "Do you think this town belongs to you?" Sarah stood in front of Ellie's wheelchair, spreading her arms. "Go away." "Now," the man grinned, "we just want to remind you that you're nobody here." One of them threw a bottle of paint that shattered at Sarah's feet, flooding the asphalt with bright red. It was a warning. They walked away, leaving the woman and her daughter terrified. When Sarah got home, her hands were shaking. She could barely cope with her emotions, but looking at Ellie, she told herself she had to be strong. The girl was silent, but her eyes were full of fear. By morning, the effects of the night were evident. The square was littered with debris. 3 cars burned to the ground, and the police building resembled a besieged fort. The news spoke of riots by radicals. No one mentioned police brutality. Michael knew that now he would be blamed for his failure, for his inability to stop the violence. He got home and saw Sarah and Ellie sitting together, their eyes red with tears. "We can't go on like this," Sarah whispered. "It's killing us. Ellie." She couldn't take another day like this. Michael hugged them, feeling his own heart break with helplessness. But he knew one thing. The night of the rage had been a turning point. No one would be the same after it. The Banks family home was immersed in a silence that pressed harder than any noise. Sarah sat next to Ellie, who was in her wheelchair. The girl was breathing slowly and heavily, her frail body as if it could no longer fight. The oxygen machine was beginning to fail again, and Sarah frantically tried to fix the problem, but it was all in vain. Her hands shook, her breathing quickened. She turned to Michael, who was standing by the door, clutching his phone. He'd just gotten word that Harrington's trial had been postponed. Once again. "Michael." Her voice was quiet, but there was panic in it. "She's not breathing." Michael dropped the phone and ran over to Ellie. He saw her small fingers weakly gripping the armrest of the wheelchair. Her fear-filled eyes looked up at him as if to ask, "Why? Why couldn't you protect me?" "Hang on, Ellie. Hold on," he shouted, trying to adjust the machine, but nothing worked. Sarah sobbed, clutching her daughter's face, her tears falling onto Ellie's hands. Michael finally realized that the machine could no longer help. He grabbed the girl, lifting her off the wheelchair, and ran to the car. Sarah ran behind, their screams and prayers breaking the silence of the night. They were at the hospital in a few minutes, but that time proved to be too much for Ellie. The doctor, looking at the monitor, shook his head. "We did the best we could," he said, quietly closing the girl's eyes. Michael and Sarah's world has crumbled. Ellie, their only daughter, was dead. A girl whose life had been a struggle had fallen victim to hatred and indifference that should never have touched a child. The news of Ellie's death spread through the city the same day. Crowds took to the streets again, but now they weren't just screaming for justice. It was an anger that swept over everything. People burned flags in front of police buildings, smashed stores. Harrington supporters openly threatened protesters. Fights broke out. Havenville became a battleground. Michael, despite his pain, knew he had to do something. He assembled his team at City Hall, but even there he faced betrayal. Some of his deputies began to speak openly against him. "You're the one who led the city into chaos, Michael," shouted one of them. "You let these people destroy everything." "These people are fighting for the truth," Michael replied firmly, his voice as cold as ice. "If you want to defend the men who killed my daughter, you're no better than they are." But even among those who remained loyal to him, doubt reigned. Michael felt alone, but he knew he had one goal: to get justice, even if it cost him everything. When Harrington finally appeared in court, the hall was filled to capacity. Residents came to see the man who took the life of a girl in a wheelchair be held accountable for his actions. But Harrington's lawyer, confident and brash, began his defense with accusations against the Banks family itself. "We all know that the mayor's family used this tragedy for political gain," he said. "My client was just doing his job. This case is a misunderstanding." Sarah, sitting in the hall, clenched her hands so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. Her anger was unbearable, but she remained silent. She knew Harrington would try to turn the whole thing inside out. Witnesses came forward one by one. People recounted years of humiliation and brutality at the hands of Harrington and other officers. But the judge seemed determined to protect the system. When it came time to pass judgment, he uttered words that shattered the hope of many. "The evidence is insufficiently compelling. Officer Harrington was acquitted." The crowd in the hall exploded. People were screaming, crying, demanding the truth. Sarah stood up, her face flaming. "You killed my daughter! You all killed her!" she shouted, pointing at the judge and Harrington. But no one listened to her. Harrington walked out of the courtroom with a slight smile, his defenders applauding him. It was a defeat the Banks family would never forget. Meanwhile, Michael stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing the crowd. They think they've won, but this fight has only just begun. My daughter gave her life so that we could see the truth. We must not allow them to continue to live with impunity. His words resonated with many. The protests didn't stop, but Michael knew that the fight for justice was a long road. Ellie couldn't be brought back, but her death became a symbol. She made people look at themselves and the city they had built. Later, sitting at home with Sarah, he whispered, "Was it worth it? Was her life worth the change?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of tears, but she answered, "She would want us not to give up." Silence filled their home again. Ellie was gone, but her memory lived on in everyone who continued to fight. Havenville would never be the same again. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Perhaps you have experienced similar injustices or racism in your life or the lives of your loved ones. It's really important for us to hear your thoughts and stories, because each of your responses helps us realize that these topics are significant and need to be discussed. We sincerely appreciate each of you taking the time to share your opinions, support our work, and bring attention to such complex but important issues. If this story has touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new episodes and give us a like. It will help us to continue creating such materials. Take care of yourself, your loved ones, and remember, every vote counts. We wish you a wonderful day.